And we are back. All right, so we now have a hover effect. We have a selection effect. However, before we continue, I think I would like to modify the transparency of the hover a little bit, which effectively also becomes the background for the selection, but we'll reduce it down to 96 and see how it looks. Yeah, we might even be able to lower it further. Yeah, let's do that. I'll go with 64. See what happens. Yeah, this is much better. It is better. Alright. Now that we actually have selection in here, thank you very much, Sky. We also have the option to properly control our buttons. So we will add in a method that takes care of handling all of our selection stuff. And we will do that up here in the helper methods. Here we will add in a select server profile and expect some kind of index. And in here we can then collectively do all of the updating needed, so we don't have to do it down in the mouse click event. This one will take care of it. And we will also allow the option of specifying a negative value to have it effectively deselect. So first of all, let's check if the index is less than 0. Then, sorry, we'll do it the right way. If index is greater than -1, then we know that it's selecting a potential server profile index, and if it's not true, then we will simply deselect it, which would then be the no, profile selection index, set that to -1, and the last thing we'll do here is invalidate to have the surface of the form redrawn. Here we'll do the selection index equals index, and here we will then figure out what to do with the buttons. So if no profile is selected, then we effectively need to disable edit, remove, start, and stop, because none of these buttons should be accessible when no specific server profile is selected. So we'll start by forcing those disabled. That would be the edit button. That would be the remove button. We also need to disable the start button and the stop button. There we go. Okay. The same basically holds true, except opposite, for a profile selection. However, note to self, these need to be changed according to configuration instead of selection. And the reason these need to be specifically configured is because we need to check whether the server is actually started and can be stopped, whether it is shut down and can be started, and so on and so forth. So for now we will just leave these two buttons disabled regardless. However, if a server profile is actually selected, then we can potentially edit that profile, and we can potentially remove it. So these need to be enabled. And for the sake of making sure that these get updated as part of the, where is it, form shown event. We will simply force select server profile, force the selection off. This is part of the initial rendering stuff anyway, so it doesn't really matter whether we effectively initiate another draw. Down the line, it might be beneficial going through these and figuring out exactly how many times we are triggering a redraw and see if we can consolidate all of the actions taken into a single redraw, just to improve performance a little bit during the startup process of the program. Nobody likes a UI that initially is laggy and sluggish, so it's part of the final optimization stuff. Typically that's something you see during game development. You throw in all the features and functions and gameplay and all that stuff, and then you go through all of it again and consolidate stuff so you can optimize the execution of the code. We can do the same thing here. Alright, so now that we have implemented this, we also need to update the mouse click event. And since we now have the selection stuff up there taking care of figuring out whether it's getting selected or deselected, we no longer need all of this stuff. We can simply pass whatever profile index was found according to the mouse position to our server profile selector, and it will then internally do all this for us. So let's trash all this. There we go. And then here we will select server profile and pass the index that getMouse profile index returns, and that fully takes care of all of the mouse selection of our individual profiles. And we should now also see that these are no longer hoverable. We can't click them. They don't do anything. The add button is still active. And if we go to vanilla, for example, edit becomes active and remove becomes active. I know it's just a slight bluish tone above over them, but it should still be visible. And works here too. If we deselect it, they are no longer hoverable. Alright. Now we have a proper point of reference for the edit button. So let's see if we can actually get it to edit the correct profile. Just in case, I always like to do the just in case thing. I absolutely hate it when my projects start crashing with some kind of weird exception that I didn't account for. So just to make sure that we actually have an index, if the profile selection index is greater than -1, then we know that we have effectively a valid server profile index. So since we want to edit, we will grab the server profile config dialog and create a new instance of it. Then we will grab the profile from our config, add the selected profile index, stuff that into the dialog, do the if dialog.show dialog modal, this equals a result of OK. Then we know that we need to update it. So we will throw the changes back at the config at the appropriate index, grabbing it directly from the dialog, since we are getting it there. and then we will do a config save because some kind of change was probably made. And finally, we will do the server profiles check, which should reload all of the different bitmaps or all the different server icon PNGs if they exist, and then finally update the UI. Last thing we need to do is to kill the dialog. So let's not do the display rectangle, no. We need to do the dispose. There we go. Alright, let's see if the edit button actually works the way we expect it to. At the moment we can't click it. We will select the vanilla 112 edit and it pops up the server profile. And we'll do the Railcraft one, and it actually shows us the correct configuration, so it's working. Very nice. Alright, we still need to implement some form of some way of handling the individual instances of the servers in terms of having them run and shut down. So next up we will see if we can implement a way of doing that. So let's see. All of the stuff that we have in here for the time being is to support all the UI stuff that we are doing. And of course the actual config. I'll do a little bit of quick cleanup here so we can get rid of some of the code that we don't need to look at right now. Like this. There we go. And get profile index is overloaded, so we need to include this one. There we go. And the profile selection, get rid of that. Whoops. Like so. And that should take care of this. Then we can collapse the selector. We can collapse the profile index stuff. Get rid of this. And these are the buttons. Now we still need to implement this. Implement starting this server. Implement stopping this server. Now, one of the things that we did with the server host class is that in the constructor we expect to get some kind of ID assigned to it. And the reason for doing this is to assist us with what we are about to do. Now, before we start digging into that, I need to quickly check whether this particular setup, yeah, it defaults to 0. If we change this to default to -1, then it will be okay to assign an ID of 0. What we are about to do is build up a list of these server host classes which matches the list of server profiles, and by assigning each server host the list index, we can use that as an ID that quickly allows us to convert to the other list because they effectively have the same index numbering. Of course, we could also add in some other kind of ID referencing and store that alongside with the server profile. But for now, I think we'll just use this just to make it a little easier for us to keep track of the individual setups. Now, for the server host, we also have a number of events. console changed, player joined, player parted, server starting, server started, server shutting down, and server stopped. These events are events that we need to collectively handle, meaning we will do common event handlers for them and simply use the ID of each individual instance of the server host class to figure out which one actually triggered this. The reason we can do this is because every event passes the server host ID, as you can see. The only one that doesn't do it is player parted and probably also player joined, and that is simply because at the time when I implemented these I forgot about the ID. So just to get these updated, we will of course add the ID to them, which would be like this and like this, and then the invoke no longer works, so we'll pass the ID here. That takes care of this, and that takes care of that one. There we go. Now we can properly identify which one triggered the event, even though we may be pointing all of them at the exact same event handlers. So let's see about getting those implemented. For this, we should probably set up a separate region. Hey, Joban. Good to see you. Let's see. The server host events. There we go. We know that from the other one, let's grab it again. I don't know why I closed it. We know that we get an event called console changed. So let's grab that one. So private void. Call this server host underscore console changed. It has a bunch of parameters, so we'll grab those. There we go. That's one of them. We will grab the next one, which would be the player joined. So server host player joined. It also has a bunch of parameters, so let's grab those as well. There we go. Well, in a sense, yes, but I know that other development environments employs a similar feature, and some of them even use the exact same setup. The only thing that a region does is it allows you to collapse part of the code and effectively hide it away, so you don't have to look at it. It is strictly a convenience thing. Well, I find them quite useful. I honestly have to admit, when I started with started looking at coding and the regions made it in there, I hated them to begin with. Absolutely, I did. But now that I have gotten used to using them, I find them highly useful because it allows me to gain a quicker overview of the code that I'm working with. Sometimes they can be a bit annoying if you, for example, have a class with a lot of regions in them and you move that class within the Solution Explorer. It automatically collapses all of them when that move is completed, and you have to sit there and open all of them again. But for the most part, I find them useful because they allow me to hide away the code that I don't need to look at right now, and especially when doing streams like this, it's beneficial to be able to hide away the code that we don't need to focus on right now. Also makes the scrolling up and down a little quicker. But it's personal preference, definitely. We need another one, which would be the, let's see, player parted event. So let's grab that one. It also has a bunch of parameters, like so. The server starting event, server host, server starting. It also has a single argument parameter, whichever you prefer calling it. It's basically the same thing. Next one would be the server started event. I'll probably move these around a bit afterwards just to get them in logical order. There we go. And of course we also need the server shutting down. Server host. And it too has an argument right there. Copy that. There we go. And the final one is the server stopped. Server host, server stopped, and it too has an argument. There we go. There. That should take care of all of them. Sweet. Alright, so in accordance with logic, these will go up here. Server starting. The console thing will go in here because it starts spewing out stuff right after we start it up. Here it has finished its startup process, which means the player joined and player parted events are valid. After that, the shutting down event triggers when we issue a stop command to it, and when it finally stops completely, the server stopped event triggers. So, yes, this one. Back in the earlier versions of Visual Studio, before we started getting the .NET framework, I used to use those constantly as well. But since then, I've gotten used to using the regions and hiding and collapsing the code that way, and if that's not enough, then I'll just do a search to find stuff. But again, personal preference. Anyhow, now we have some common event handlers. Next thing we should do is probably see if we can do something about setting up a list of server hosts. Now, it will be a little bit difficult handling this list because it may become desynchronized if one server is running and a profile is removed from the current server profiles list. That means the one that's running needs to stay and the other one needs to be disposed of. So at some point we may want to alter the server profile structure to include the actual ID number that we assigned the server host instance in the server host list. That way the actual position within the list can go out of sync and we will still be able to find the correct server profile in the server profiles list versus the correct server host within the server host list. So that's something that we will look at some point. For now, we will simply just do a quick hard coding of all of it. Okay, we need a list of the server host type. Call it server hosts. There we go. And then since we know that as part of the Actually, let's collapse this quick and this, because we need to go into the load event. Now here it loops through all the profiles, and when we reach this point, all of the profiles have already been loaded. They have been checked to see if there is a server icon available, and that has been loaded. So this would probably be a good point to do a copy of, create the server host list. So let's go and see if we can get that done. All right. So let's loop through here. No, actually, we will create a method here, private void initialize server host list, like so, and then just call that instead. Alright, so let's loop through the profiles in the config and see if we can get some stuff assigned. So for this we need a quick we need to create a local one here. I'll just call it host. Throw this in, and we need to put some kind of ID in. For now we will just put the counter. Then we need to hook its hook the events, but actually I think we will instead just do this server hosts.add a new one of these, and I'll then just index it. We need to hook this one, which would be server host console changed. Let's try and see if we can maintain the logical order, which would be server starting, server host, server starting, right there. The next one would be the server start set. Server start set. There we go. This one actually needs to be there. Next one would be the player joined. Player joined. And the player parted right here. Player parted. And then the server shutting down right here. Server host, server shutting down. And the server stopped, which is right there. Host server stopped right here. There we go. Now the events are hooked, and then we can configure the server with the profile. Except right now it doesn't exactly support us passing the profile itself. So we will go add an overload for that. And for now we will simply just throw it in there. Profiles.p. There we go. There is no argument given blah 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 blah. Yep, we know. So we'll grab server host right here and find the configure server method right there. Alright, so we'll do an overload for that. Configure server and accept a server profile. And from here we'll simply just call the other one. Configure server. It needs the server path, so that will be the profile path, the profile jar, and the profile memory. There we go. Does the same thing. just lets us pass the profile itself instead of having to go through and put all the individual variable names in there. Let's see there, like this, and the server profile to apply. There we go. Nice and sweet. Okay, so we've now set it up, we've configured it, and we should be good to go, more or less. Um, um, let's see. Da, 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 da. Right. Okay. Let me have a quick look here. We've got the selection stuff. Yeah. All right. Now, like I said earlier, we can end up becoming out of sync with these. So down the line, we will probably need to implement a couple of additional helper methods to keep track of this, as well as update the actual server profile with an ID that we can store, so we can actually keep track of them even if the lists are desynchronized. But we'll worry about that later. For now, we'll just assume that these two lists are always in the same order, and just use the ID to directly access the profile if needed. We know that we've got the server starting and server start set events. These will help us figure out whether we need to update the start and stop buttons. We also need to update the actual server profile selection stuff to properly reference the list of server hosts, and check with them whether the server is running or not, and then set the buttons accordingly. So we need to do a little bit of updating here and there. For this, we should probably start by figuring out whether our setup currently has a profile selected, and if so, we can do all the updating of it. But just to make sure, we need to do the cross-thread handling. So we'll put those in quick. And we also need, actually we'll do this one. Alright, if, what were those? Profile selection index is greater than -1, then we'll go see here. We'll check up against the ID. Actually, we'll just check the ID. If these are identical, then we need to disable the start button. There we go. Like I said, this this is assuming both lists are synced. Alright. For now, we might not need this. We definitely need to figure out whether the server has started, and that's pretty much the same business as above. Though in this case we need to enable the start button if this specific profile is selected. A small helper method could easily do the correct selection index versus ID conversion for us, so it wouldn't be a huge thing to get this updated for proper ID synchronization later on. Let's get the invoke required here. and get this out of the way. And the server host ID, there we go. Return, and this one of course needs to be uppercase, and this is pretty much the same thing. If the current selection index equals the host ID, then enable the stop button. There we go. And I should probably put in warning. These don't do anything with Visual Studio, by the way. Warning and to do and such. I've gotten into the habit of putting them in. I use note, I use to do, and I use warning, all in capital letters. And then I simply do a search for them when I need to go through and check up on what I might have put in there to remind myself of stuff to do and notes and whatnot. But unfortunately, Visual Studio doesn't pick these up. IntelliJ, for example, has a similar feature, or actually has that feature implemented, where you can put in the 2 slashes for a comment followed by some kind of keyword that it will then track and stuff in the error warning message list. But here, sadly, Visual Studio doesn't implement any of this, so for now I'm just using them to remind myself of stuff. Okay, so may not need this for now. We've got the events implemented in case we want to do something with them later on. We don't know yet. We might want to. Okay, moving on. If we run into the server starting its shutdown process, then we also need to take care of that. This would be an int. This is again strictly to update the buttons if needed. And again, it's similar to this one, except we need to disable it. So I'll grab this, do a false. And finally, pretty much the same thing for the invoke required, the server stopped. New action, int again, grab the method name, there we go, pass the server host ID, and this would then be the opposite of the starting. There we go. So let's put that in here and then enable the start button if this one is selected. Another thing that we could do is to, now that we've got all of these events hooked, we could output those in the debug just to see that these actually run separately. Alright, so let's see. Yeah, let's put some debug information in here. Might be a good idea. Alright, so Astix debug right line, and then go with server host ID is starting up. Yeah, might as well do them. Invoke required. Then add the int, string, and string to it. followed by this one, the log level, and the log message. There we go. Right, then here we will leave this as is for now. We don't need to spew the output with all the junk that comes from the server. Here we will add in one line that tells us that server server host ID is now running. There we go. We'll do these right away so we don't forget. Strings, string, and a byte array. Server host ID, player name, player UUID, and the IP information. Yes, I know, sorry. And since these two are virtually identical, whoops, we'll grab a quick copy of this and just change the method. There we go. And this one is now shutting down, so let's grab the diagnostics, debug, write line. Server number, host ID is shutting down. And finally, server has stopped. There we go. Now at least we can keep track of them. Alright, so next up, we definitely need to dig into the start and stop buttons. Start and stop should only be accessible when a specific server profile is selected. And of course, these two buttons being enabled also depends on the current state of the currently selected server profile. So we may need to do a little bit of magic there to get that working. To help us in that process, we do have a couple of things available to us. So let's go have a look at the, let's see, where is it? Right here, the select server profile. Now here we kind of expect that we have the server host list synchronized with it, like I said, assumption. So we'll put in lists may at some point become desynced. Alright, so the profile selection index points to which profile is currently selected. So we'll assume that all of this stuff is synchronized, and then we'll go if the server host profile selection index is, I do believe we have a property that determines whether it's running or not. Yes, running. If it's running, then we will enable the stop button, and if it is not running, then we will enable the start button. There we go. And these should of course be opposite each other. So in this case the start button needs to be disabled, false, and the stop button needs to be enabled. In the other case, the start button needs to be enabled and the stop button needs to be disabled. So that should take care of that quick. And then down here, click event can pretty much only happen if we can click on an enable button. Just to make sure, we'll do a check on the selection index, and then we will see if we can get this one, profile selection index, to start. And if this happens, then we will quickly disable this one. There we go. And we can pretty much do the same thing down here. So if we have a selection index that's greater than -1 and this one is currently running, then we will attempt to stop it. Profile selection index dot stop. There we go. And then we'll disable the stop button. There we go. Now keep in mind, this is basically a hack directly into these lists. So if we do specific things with this, it will become desynchronized and the whole world will crash. At the moment, we luckily don't have any kind of code in the remove button, so the chance of us destroying this right away is not particularly big. But let's give this a run and see what happens. Do we end up with a crash fest, or do we actually end up getting something that might work? Let's see. Start is enabled, stop is not. Let's see if we can start this. And something went wrong. And the something that went wrong is that A, we haven't configured the host instance, and B, we have not initialized the event hooking. So this one we need to run, let's see, right here. It's actually doing its run, so that's good. The one thing we didn't do, I couldn't remember whether I added it down there or not, but we do need to configure it properly, which it has done there, but we have not configured the archon for it. That's what's missing. Now, since two different server instances won't be able to bind to the exact same port, at some point we may want to add to the server configuration which archon port to use. We can either do that in the actual server profile itself, or we can do it in the server properties settings, depending on how we choose to store this information. For now, though, we will simply hardcode these settings, since at the moment we are basically just going through an attempt at getting this running. So the remote console port for now will be 25.665 plus the counter. So the first one will be 25.665 and the second one will be 25.666. We will also tell it to use a randomized password, and there we go. Now let's see what happens. Oh, server 0 is starting up. And yes, indeed it is. The stop button got enabled. We'll see if we can start the other one. Server 1 is starting up and something crashed. Oops. Out of bounds. It still started up because it doesn't care about our stuff running. For the sake of keeping things straight, we may need to shut these down. Yep. You may shut down now, please. Ah, might be hanging here because of this. Okay, so we did get some weird thing that we didn't account for in the from the console of the Forge setup. Let's see, what are we looking for right here? This one is expecting some kind of slash, which means one of the log entries dumped some information that didn't include some kind of source. So let's see if we can figure out what that was. Main debug, server thread. Okay, we don't exactly know what that was, but we know that it's derping out because it's not finding that particular slash. So to account for this, we will do a quick check to see if the source info actually does have an instance of a slash. If it does, then we will properly set these. String source equals blah, and string log level equals blah. Alright, so if this is the case, we'll split these correctly, and if it's not in there, then we will simply set the source to source info, and the log level to, let's just force it to be info. Okay, that should take care of that particular crash issue. Let's see what happens. Start up the vanilla server. And it popped right there. And then let's see if we can start the other one. And at least it didn't crash. At least not yet. Okay. Something seems to be working its way through. There we go. And we should be up. Let's see if we can shut down the vanilla server. And it's saving and shutting down. Let's see if we can shut down the modded server. And something went wrong. Okay, so there might be an Archon problem there. It says it connected. Well, something went wrong. Okay. We need to go bug hunting. Since this might be a cross-thread problem somewhere, I think I'm gonna hunt for this particular bug off stream, perhaps sometimes during the weekend, and see if I can figure out exactly what went wrong with it. And then, of course, I'll go through it and explain what my findings were. At least for now, we've seen that it can properly draw two different distinct profiles. Of course, there's still some information missing. There's a lot we still need to do on the UI itself. And I need to find and possibly fix that bug, and there's still a ton of stuff to do here. But I think for now that I will call it a day. Closing the previous instance before opening a new? Well, not really. I think what happens is that possibly the Archon, the source remote console class that runs in a separate thread, I think this one shuts down prematurely. But I'll go through it and trace it and see if I can find exactly where it goes wrong and why it goes wrong. And then on the next stream, which unfortunately will be next Friday, I will not be able to stream on Wednesday the 18th. I've had some schedule juggling to do, and I just couldn't fit all of it into my schedule, unfortunately. So next stream will be next Friday, a week from now. But at that point, I will go through what the bug was, how to fix it, and then we'll take it from there. For now, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed the stream. Please feel free to throw questions, comments, feedback in the chat. As a note, I'm working on setting up a sort of media site where I'll keep track of the project, the changes, link to GitHub repos, YouTube copies of the streams, and so on and so forth. I don't know exactly when I will be done with it, but at some point I will post a link to a information/media hub for everything that's going on here. In any case, it was an absolute pleasure having everyone on stream today, so thank you very much for joining, and I will talk to all of you next week. Have a great weekend.